I have an incredible true story to tell you about empathy and second chances. And it all begins over the White Cliffs of Dover in 1940. The country's in the grips of the Second World War, and overhead, the horrendous deep drone of an approaching German bomber starts to puncture the serenity of a calm, sunny summer morning. Then in a makeshift airfield nearby, a Spitfire takes to the air to ward off the approaching bomber. In the pilot's seat of the plane is Flight Lieutenant James Jeffries. As he climbs into the air, he can see the German plane advancing. So with a blast of his throttle, he soars further up into the sky, bringing himself directly behind the bomber. Jeffries then lets rip, pulling the trigger on the Spitfire's machine gun and spraying around 300 bullets right through the German bomber. Instant plumes of smoke begin to billow from the plane. The bomber starts to bank heavily to its right, clearly resetting its course back to mainland Europe. Jeffries therefore tailgates the plane for a few moments before flying directly beside the plane to inspect the damage. As he drives up close, he could see the devastation that the machine guns had caused. The plane no longer has any glass in its windows, and in the pilot's seat was a critically injured pilot. Jeffries in that moment thinks, well, I'll just tailgate the plane again, just so I can send several more bullets into its engines. That's inevitably going to send it dramatically into the sea. But just as he's about to do that, the German pilot turns to look at Jeffries. The badly injured German then salutes to Jeffries, and it's at that point that Jeffries can see just how badly injured the pilot was, as he only had one finger remaining on his hand. It's in that moment that Jeffrey decides to let the bomber fly away, knowing that any chances of the pilot surviving are incredibly slim anyway. Well, the war finally ends, and Jeffrey survives many more battles over the south coast of England. He settles down, marries, and has 2 children called Brenda and James Jr. And as with most military families, both children followed their father into the RAF, with James Jr. becoming a flight lieutenant himself. The story now fast forwards to 1989, and James Jr. is stationed in Berlin, where he lives with his wife and their 7-year-old son, another James Jeffrey Jr., but referred to as Jimmy. And our war hero, James Jeffries, now in his 70s, gets over to Berlin whenever he can to see his beloved grandson, who, as you can only imagine, loves to hear all about his granddad's Spitfire stories. But then one day, whilst visiting the family in Berlin, horror struck. Whilst walking home from school, little Jimmy gets hit by a bus whilst crossing the road and is now in intensive care in the local hospital. James Jr. rings his dad and says, "Dad, get to the hospital as soon as you can." When they arrive, James Jr. meets his dad at the hospital entry and tells him everything's actually going to be okay. He explains that if it wasn't for the actions of a passing stranger who threw himself in the way of the bus to push Jimmy to safety, things could have been so much worse. James Sr. felt as if his heart was about to explode from his chest. "If only I can meet this stranger to say thank you," suggests James Sr. "Well, you can," said his son. "He's alive and he's recovering, and he's actually in the bed adjacent to Jimmy." And with that, James Sr. ran into the hospital, defying his age and sprinting towards the ward. And as he walks in, he sees his grandson sat up in bed, playing with a toy Spitfire. In the bed adjacent is an elderly man, also in his late 70s. And as James Sr. approaches the man to say thank you, they looked at each other and froze. This was the first time their eyes had met in 42 years. The German then sat up and saluted at James Sr. There was just one finger on his hand. "It's been a long time, my friend," said Flight Lieutenant James Jeffries. Sometimes it's easy to kick people when they're down. We can also lose sight in the importance of empathy, especially when the person who needs it isn't exactly your favourite person. So the next time someone in your world is looking for a second chance, a helping hand, or a bit of your empathy, never forget how important your reaction might be in the long run.